He officially declares a salary of $140,000 a year. His declared assets are a small apartment in St. Petersburg, 3 Russian cars, and a Soviet-era trailer. On paper, he is a modestly compensated public servant. In reality, according to testimony before the American Senate and analyses by Western economists, Vladimir Putin has accumulated a fortune estimated between $70 billion and $200 billion, all hidden in networks of oligarchs, shell companies, and offshore accounts. If those numbers are accurate, he would be the richest man in the history of humanity. And no one around him has the courage to confirm that out loud, because those who tried are no longer with us to tell the story. Behind the impassive face, the calculated gestures, and the silence he wields like a weapon, there is a story that begins in a bathroomless apartment in a gray suburb of Leningrad and ends in a $1.35 billion palace on the edge of the Black Sea. A story of how a KGB spy considered mediocre by his own superiors transformed a country in ruins into his personal empire and eliminated one by one everyone who dared to say so out loud. Today, the hidden face of Vladimir Putin, the most dangerous man on the planet, and the secret that 140 million Russians still refuse to admit. The son of the KGB. Vladimir Putin was born on October 7, 1952, in Leningrad, into a working-class family in a poor suburb. He grew up in an apartment without a bathroom, shared with other families, in a gray Soviet-era concrete block. He was a small, quiet boy and frequent target of bullying, until he discovered judo and sambo, martial arts he still practices today. The discipline of the fighting academies would shape his vision of power forever. Whoever controls the body controls everything. At 23, he joined the KGB. He served as an intelligence agent in Dresden, East Germany, where his main role was to recruit Western informants and monitor dissidents. It was there that he learned the tools that define his government to this day: surveillance, psychological manipulation, and the art of accumulating compromising information about powerful people. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, Putin was in Dresden watching a crowd storm the local Stasi office. He went out to face them alone, saying the building was armed. They backed down. He called Moscow for instructions. The answer was silence. The empire had disappeared. And in that moment, in the cold of Dresden, a mediocre ex-spy made a silent decision. He would never again depend on anyone above him. 10 years later, he would be president of the largest nation on earth. And what he did in his first years surprised even his harshest critics. What he actually did. When Putin took power in 2000, Russia was in total collapse. The economy had shrunk 40% over the previous decade. Inflation wiped out savings overnight. Oligarchs plundered the country's natural resources, while pensioners went months without payment. Chechen terrorist attacks were blowing up schools and theaters in Moscow. The Russian state had lost control of its own territory. In his first 2 terms, gross domestic product grew 72%. The average salary jumped from $80 to $640 a month. Millions climbed out of poverty. Russia paid off its International Monetary Fund debt ahead of schedule and accumulated $600 billion in sovereign reserves. For much of the population, Putin was not just a president, he was the man who gave dignity back to a humiliated country. But behind that image of national redeemer, there was a man living with a level of paranoia that no democratic leader on the planet would dare admit to. And those details reveal more about his true character than any speech or economic index. The man who sleeps in different rooms. According to former security agents and investigative journalists, Putin never sleeps in the same room 2 nights in a row out of fear of assassination. He travels with a personal doctor, a food taster, and a kit of his own blood type for emergency transfusion. In March 2015, he simply disappeared for 10 days. No public appearances, no official statements, no explanation. The world speculated. Was he dead? Had he suffered a coup? When he reappeared, he said only that it had been a boring period without him. What happened during those 10 days was never explained. In meetings with world leaders, he arrived deliberately late, sometimes by hours. Angela Merkel waited 4 hours. Pope John Paul II waited. Queen Elizabeth waited. But his most calculated gesture was bringing his Labrador to a meeting with Merkel, who has a documented phobia of dogs after being bitten. Merkel was visibly terrified. Putin smiled. The cameras captured everything. In 2009, he sent President Obama a book about the same dog, knowing Obama was allergic and had publicly mentioned that his daughter wanted one. Analysts interpreted the gesture as a silent, precise message. I know everything about you. Every detail is a weapon. Every silence is a threat. But psychological intimidation was only the softest tool in his arsenal. For those with too much money or too much voice, a far more brutal system was waiting. The oligarchs and the system of fear. The oligarchs thought Putin would be controllable, a quiet bureaucrat who would follow orders. They were wrong. In 2003, he ordered the arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, then the richest man in Russia and owner of the oil giant Yukos, in an operation that shocked the business world. Khodorkovsky had committed 2 mistakes. He funded opposition parties and spoke publicly about government corruption. He spent 10 years in prison. Yukos was dismantled and its assets absorbed by the state-owned Rosneft. The message was clear. The money is yours, but the power is mine. Support the Kremlin or lose everything. Khodorkovsky lost 10 years of his life. Others lost far more. According to William Browder, former investor in Russia and creator of the Magnitsky Act, Putin informally charged approximately 50% of the main oligarch's profits in exchange for political and legal protection. This structure made him the country's biggest oligarch without having anything in his own name. The fortune of 70 to 200 billion exists in a web of relatives and childhood friends who serve as front men. But Putin's control did not stop at Russia's borders. In St. Petersburg, his hometown, the Internet Research Agency operated in shifts, financed by Yevgeny Prigozhin, his closest ally. Hundreds of employees created fake profiles, spread disinformation, and polarized elections across the West. The American Senate concluded that the agency directly interfered in the 2016 election that brought Donald Trump to power. It was a war waged without a single bullet, and no one noticed until it was too late. But those who tried to expose this system did not just lose their cases, and one of them published the evidence on YouTube on the exact day he was arrested. The palace and the man who exposed it. In January 2021, Alexei Navalny published a video that would become the most watched in Russian history. With detailed floor plans, photos leaked by construction workers, and financial documents, he revealed a secret palace on the Black Sea 39 times larger than the Principality of Monaco, with a casino, theater, underground hockey rink, vineyard, private church, private port, an FSB-enforced no-fly zone, and a pole dance bar. Cost $1.35 billion. The video reached 93 million views in 1 week. Putin denied being the owner. A childhood friend oligarch publicly claimed the property days later. The context is even more disturbing. Navalny had just returned to Russia after surviving a Novichok poisoning, a military-grade nerve agent that only governments can produce, and was arrested at the airport upon landing. The video was released while he was in detention. In February 2024, he died in a penal colony in the Russian Arctic, 1,900 kilometers from Moscow, under conditions human rights organizations classified as slow torture. The authorities said it was natural causes. The world did not believe it. But Navalny was not the first. And the question the Kremlin never answered is this: if this is what happens to the world's most famous critic, with the entire West's cameras pointed at him, what happened to those who spoke up before, when no one was watching? those who knew too much. In October 2006, journalist Anna Politkovskaya, who had spent years documenting Russian atrocities in Chechnya and openly criticizing Putin, was shot dead in the elevator of her Moscow apartment building. It was Putin's birthday. In November of the same year, Alexander Litvinenko, a former FSB agent who had accused Putin of ordering assassinations, was poisoned in a London hotel with polonium-210, a radioactive isotope that only a state can produce. He died in agony 3 weeks later. In 2016, British Judge Robert Owen concluded after 6 months of public investigation that the assassination was probably approved by President Putin. Russia denied it. It always denies. Between 2022 and 2023, at least 12 executives of major Russian energy and gas companies died under suspicious circumstances, including falls from windows, unexplained suicides, and accidents. They all had one thing in common. They had questioned the war in Ukraine or had conflicts with the Kremlin. The Western press called it Russian window syndrome. Not a single death was independently investigated. And then came the most cinematic case of all. Yevgeny Prigozhin, founder of the Wagner Group, the world's most powerful private army with tens of thousands of mercenaries, had been Putin's closest ally for decades. In June 2023, he led an armed rebellion against the Russian military command, marching his men to within 200 kilometers of Moscow before standing down. 2 months later, his plane exploded in the air. All 10 passengers died. Putin expressed condolences. The Kremlin denied involvement. According to Reporters Without Borders, more than 50 journalists have been killed in Russia since Putin took power. Those who survive self-censor. Those who resisted learned that criticizing Putin is not a political position. It is a death sentence with no fixed date. And with all of this documented, proven, and published, the world still does not know what to do with a man who has been in power for 25 years, holds an active international arrest warrant, and continues to be invited to negotiate the future of the planet. The legacy. The world still fears to name. In 2020, Putin pushed through a constitutional reform, allowing him to remain in power until 2036. The referendum was held during the COVID-19 pandemic, with ballot boxes set up in parks, apartment courtyards, and car trunks. International observers documented massive irregularities. One amendment redefined marriage as only between a man and a woman, inserted to distract conservative public opinion, while the term limit amendment slipped through unnoticed. In 2024, he was re-elected with 87% of the vote in an election with opposition candidates imprisoned or barred from running. The invasion of Ukraine in 2022 produced numbers the world still refuses to face. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, Russian casualties reached 1 million between killed, wounded, and missing, more than all British losses over the 6 years of World War II. On the Ukrainian side, 400,000 military casualties, between 60,000 and 100,000 dead, the rest wounded, disabled, or missing. The UN verified more than 12,000 Ukrainian civilians killed. More than 5.3 million Ukrainians fled the country. The International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for the illegal deportation of Ukrainian children. He is the only sitting head of state of a G20 country with an active international arrest warrant. The story of Vladimir Putin is the story of how a power vacuum can be filled by a man with patience enough to wait, intelligence enough to observe, and coldness enough to act without hesitation. It is the story of how a small boy from a gray suburb of Leningrad built an empire on silence. The silence of those who were bought, the silence of those who were threatened, and the permanent silence of those who were eliminated. The numbers that remain: 25 years in power, more than 50 journalists killed, 12 oligarchs dead under suspicious circumstances in 2 years, 1 million Russian casualties in a war he chose to start, more than $200 billion in hidden wealth, a $1.35 billion palace on the Black Sea, and 0 convictions, 0 prosecutions, 0 consequences. And while the world debates sanctions and diplomatic protocols, the palace stands, with its no-fly zone, with its workers banned from carrying phones, and with its owner who officially never existed. Now you know what happens behind the most dangerous man on the planet. If you enjoyed this story, wait until you see what comes next. It is already on your screen. Click and watch. See you there.